story follows very well, I think. Oh, excuse me. My story follows very well from Reverend Atchison's talk and from this whole concept of being able to turn your life around. This was a story that was reported in the New York Times in an article entitled Prison and Poverty. Carl Harris lived in a low-income neighborhood near the Capitol. He didn't come close to earning a minimum wage, and he dropped out of high school and ended up working at a car wash, envying the fancy imports driven by the drug dealers. In 1983, he was walking with his girlfriend on a sidewalk where drugs were being sold. He watched a high-level dealer pull up in his Mercedes-Benz and demand money from an underling. Mr. Harris says, this dealer was draped down in jewelry and a nice outfit. The female with him was also draped down in gold and everything and dressed real good. He adds, I'm watching the way he carries himself, and I'm standing there looking like Raggedy Ann. My girl looks like Raggedy Ann, and I said to myself, that's what I want to do. 2 years later, he was convicted of illegal gun possession. He was sent to the local prison shortly after his first daughter was born. And he kept up his drug dealing in prison. He said, it's just as easy to sell inside as out. After he returned to the streets in the heyday of the crack market in the 80s, and at this point the police knew he was dealing, but they could never catch him with the cocaine that he was importing by the kilo from New York. One day, he went into an apartment to retrieve $4,000 worth of cocaine and discovered it was already being smoked by a dozen people. He said, I just lost it. I grabbed a lamp and a chair and started smacking people. Nobody was hospitalized, but I broke someone's arm and cut somebody's leg pretty bad. At this point, he was convicted on 2 counts of assault, each carrying a 3-year term. But he received a much stiffer sentence of 15 to 45 years on a charge of armed robbery. The cops made up the burglary charge because they couldn't prove that he was dealing drugs. So at 24, he faced prison until his mid-40s. Despondent, he began snorting heroin in prison. I thought I was going to lose my mind, he said. I felt so bad leaving my wife alone with our daughters when they were so young. And they'd ask me on the phone where I was, and I'd tell them I was away at camp. His wife went on welfare, living with relatives, sleeping in abandoned cars. Some days she'd travel 3 days on a bus to try to visit him, because we have a habit of not imprisoning people near their homes, but moving them far away, making it very hard for families to stay in contact, along with the phone charges. But his wife was very steadfast, and she stuck by him. She was often homeless until she eventually found a federally subsidized apartment. And once the children were in school, she was able to take a part-time job. She said, we ate a lot of oodles of noodles. Basically, she said this, basically I was locked up with him. My mind was locked up, my life was locked up, and our daughters grew up without a father. Carl Harris felt he deserved being locked up for a few years, but didn't see what a good it did him to be there for 2 decades. Just before turning 30, he turned his life around. He gave up drugs, he got his GED, but he still had 14 more years to serve before he could get out. But he stayed in touch with his family. Upon getting out, he said, I was a man coming out of a cage after 20 years. The streets were the same, but everything else changed. My kids were grown, and they had to teach me how to use a cell phone and how to pay for a bus. The only job he could find was in the laundry, sorting soiled linens for $8.25 an hour. He said, "You spend long enough in prison being constantly treated like a dog or a parrot, and you can get so institutionalized, you can't function outside." And that was my biggest challenge, telling myself that I'm not going to forget how to take care of myself or think for myself. I saw this happen to too many guys. His wife said prison was good for him in some ways. He finally grew up there. But 20 years? They overdid it. It didn't have to take him that long. Now the family has risen above the poverty level. Their girls finished high school. One of them was in college. His wife is an aide in a hospital, and he's a security guard. This is a good ending for them. The greatest cost of imprisonment are the burdens of poverty placed on the prison's families and community during incarceration.